Thank you. Ken, you're on.
Great, thank you. Good evening, everyone. This is Monday, June 8th, 2020. It's the Town Council, New Shore Town Council Budget Work Session. The New Shore Town Council is meeting via telecommunications pursuant to State of Rhode Island Executive Order 2025, dated April 15th, 2020. We do have an agenda concerning the budget. I'd like to remind everybody that to ensure the broadest and most stable means of public engagement and public budget work sessions and the public hearing, public comment is encouraged through telephonic hand raising via the Zoom platform. Members of the public will be able to listen to the work sessions by using their telephone keypad to dial in the Zoom meeting using information provided in the agenda. Members of the public who wish to offer comment during the budget work session have been asked to register in advance of the meeting. This will facilitate calling on the individuals who wish to speak. During the meeting, the public comment section of the meeting or public hearing, the members of the public may raise their virtual hand by pressing the *9 key on their telephone. Myself or one of the co-hosts will recognize the individual by name and then unmute their phone. Once the speaker is done, their phone will be muted again. All members of the public are asked to keep their phones muted unless called upon or until called upon to speak. Members of the public will be recognized in turn and everyone may speak once on the subject. I'll also remind everyone who's participating in the meeting at the town level to please be wary of any noise you may be making while watching or listening to the meeting. If you're going to be making some noise or typing or something, please mute yourself because that will pick up and you'll be blanking over somebody else. So we'll give it a shot and see how it goes this evening. This is the first meeting where we will be allowing public comment via the Zoom platform, so we'll look forward to having a good discussion. First item on the agenda is a review of the fiscal year 2020 budget as presented, and I'd like to turn it over first to start to Interim Town Manager Jim Kern. Jim, are you there?
I am. Make sure I get unmuted here.
You are.
Thank you. I'm gonna give a quick introduction to kind of take us from where we were when we went in almost concurrent with our budget preparation, which was also already in terms of process somewhat modified by the fact that there was a change in the position that I hold with Mr. Robert leaving and me being hired as so that's an unusual circumstance that had the finance director and others department heads had worked through, and we were on the precipice of putting the budget together when all of the requirements associated with managing the community's response to the coronavirus kind of inserted itself into this process. So I think the biggest takeaway I'd like people to hear from what I'm going to say is that we are going to, this is about numbers and dollars and math, but it's also in terms of managing what this town and other towns are going to deal with over the coming fiscal year 21, but likely at least 22. You want to try to keep much of it in front of you, is a phrase I use. Keep your options in front of you so that as the things that are uncertain right now become more certain, and the two big ones are what we might call our organic revenue uncertainty, which is meal tax, hotel tax, all the other typical revenue sources, but also any federal aid or state aid or whatever they're going to call that, rescue, whatever it is. As those things become more known, you want to have the maximum flexibility to either adjust, hopefully in a positive way, but you also need to be prepared to adjust in a negative way. So with that, the original budget that we put together early in the spring was already rather constrained. It counted on a 4% increase in the tax levy, a very limited capital plan. The largest expense drivers were a proposed 3.2% increase to the school appropriation, not large by historical standards, and then the second year of a program to bring town employees closer to regional averages, an important thing to do. But those were the two that were kind of left in the budget. There wasn't a lot of new programs, and that has something to do with the change in personnel in key positions. As a result of significant revenue shortfalls in both the present year, and that's important, present meaning the fiscal year we're still operating in, that's important because it obviously has an effect on reserves. And I gave a little speech about reserves in a recent meeting, that this town's in a position to even have a conversation about using reserves. There are some that aren't. And in those cases, they're already executing furloughs and other things. But that's going to affect your reserves coming out of this year. And the budget that we've put together contemplates using additional reserves, but also makes some changes or proposes some changes. And I need to emphasize that some of these are collective bargaining issues that haven't been resolved. There have been preliminary discussions, and they are represented in here as a proposal. So I gave a breakdown in the memo to the council. The big adjustments, use of reserves to balance a budget that has been affected by, as I said, the organic reduction in revenue, and also an anticipated reduction. Use of reserves at 29%. Some more aggressive revenue projections, which you have the option to do that, but you also need to keep an eye on it. The shift, the additional reduction in any capital program, and shifting what a larger percentage of what we are suggesting to the infrastructure fund, that's 12%. So between those three, it's 70% of the change from March to now. Next would be the deferral of the unionized people that work for the town and some for the schools. The NSEA salary adjustment is 7%. Reduction of the school appropriation is proposed at 5%. The attendant reduction in benefit costs from the original budget, that's not actually a cut in this case. That's as people who like to talk about budgets, it's either a removal of an increase or a reduction of an increase. Other expense, that's 5%. Other expense reductions, 5%. You've got a health insurance stabilization fund through the trust that you've accumulated over some number of years. This would be a good year to spend it in the finance director's judgment. So that's 4%. And the last two, a deferral of a non-union salary increase would be 2%, and a salary adjustment of the town manager's salary at a little under 1%. So approximately 20% of the adjustment comes from personnel costs, which are what we used to call personnel costs, salaries and adjustment to benefits. And as I said, that would be a reduction to what was planned, but not a reduction. And the rest made up by more aggressive revenue estimates, reduction in capital, use of reserves. One note on use of reserves before I send it over to Amy. As I said in my kind of opener, reserves gives you the opportunity to keep the flexibility to let things play out a little bit. But you have to keep your eye focused on the idea that it may play out unfavorably as well as favorably. And although this community is in a position to use reserves, you also want to keep in mind that the use of reserves is not a sustainable way to maintain a budget. I think, this is an international economic question, whether this is going to be similar to the Gulf War in the early 90s, and the recovery is quick, or it's going to be a 3 or 4 year recovery. I think the general consensus is it's going to be more the former than the latter. And if that's the case, a use of reserves makes sense within the general constraints of that. But it's one of the things you need to understand and keep in mind as we go through this, that use reserves long-term isn't going to be sustainable, but an awful good thing to be in a position to have that flexibility. It's a management issue. If you have reserves, it's a very different issue. So with that, I'll send it over to the Finance Director, Amy Land, and let her take us through what she's provided in the order that she's going to identify. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I'll just remind everybody once more that if you do, or you're at your computer or whatnot, and you are making noise, it does sort of, sometimes it overbears on the meeting. So please, if you're going to be making any kind of noise with any kind of bottles or cans or typing or anything like that, please mute yourself. Amy Land, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Ken. Before I get started, I do want to let people know who might be at home that all of the documents we're referring to today are available on the town's website, as well as the schedule for the rest of the budget hearings. They're also attached to the clerk base agenda for today's meeting. Jim's given you a pretty good high-level introduction to where we were and where we are today and how those two positions are different. Before we get into the details of the budget, I want to carry that a little bit further and pick up on the theme of uncertainty and flexibility, because those are probably the two defining characteristics of this budget. We don't have a great sense of what the next 3 to 6 months are going to bring, and therefore we need to preserve the flexibility to keep this town running in the most fiscally responsible way. And when you talk about what those revenues might be, they could be at the levels that we are projecting, and we'll talk about the specifics. They could be significantly lower, or they could be higher, or, and this is the even greater unknown, there's opportunity for state and federal aid to flow through to the town. What we don't know is what the amount is and what the timing will be. But we've been careful with this budget to preserve the flexibility on the spending side, not to reduce everything down to zero, so that if those dollars do come in, either through regular revenues or through state and federal aid, we can continue to pursue the projects that we wanted to pursue, at least at some level. So preserving that flexibility if things are shaping up well. And then the second part of that is acknowledging the responsibility and the obligation that we have if things don't shape up at the levels that we've projected. If those revenues are lower than what we're looking for, and if outside aid is not available, then we're going to have to sit down together in the fall and the winter and really trim this budget even further. And I just want everyone to be prepared for that, to keep it in the back of your mind. It would be premature to do it now. We don't want to tie our hands, but we also need to be ready if that second step presents itself. So with that really optimistic thought, let's get into the details and see what's in front of us. If you'd like to start on page 2 of the budget document,
The budget
which is
document,
tax revenue.
Amy, I'm sorry, but by budget document, you mean
Sure.
the document that's like 22 pages and it says general fund, operating and capital budget?
Yes, the document with the numbers.
Yep.
And then for anyone who does have the narrative, we're using the same narrative that's dated March 11th. Some of the information has changed. We'll talk through what has changed, but the basic operating structure of the town continues to follow the model that's presented in that document. If anyone can see, it's a Word-based document, and we'll start with taxes then on page 1 of that. Feel free to jump in as well. We're looking at 2 different sets of comparisons. We're comparing last year to this year for budget, and we're comparing the March budget to the budget we're looking at today. So if I jumble those in any way, feel free to speak up and ask for clarification. We were already looking, when it came to tax revenue, at a 4% tax levy increase. As Jim said, it was a constrained budget when we put it together. The revised version maintains that 4% tax levy increase, which is the maximum allowed under state law. It does, however, reduce the anticipated collection rate by 0.5% down to 97.5%. And most communities are looking at a reduced collection rate somewhere in the 0.5 to 1% range. So that's fairly consistent with what other people are planning for. Year to date, through May, we're about 1% behind last year. So I think we're in the right range. Again, we may be a little bit aggressive in order to leave room. We'll see how those August collections come in and be able to adjust from there. You'll also see the second line on the tax page, prior property and auto taxes, with the revised fiscal year 21 number of $250,000. That is lower, obviously, than the recommended. And that's because we anticipate those people who may not be able to pay their taxes either in the spring of this year or going into August are unlikely then to be catching up on back taxes that may be out there. We will at some point in 21 hold a tax sale, but that will be taxes up through fiscal year 19. It will not address anything that's outstanding for the current year. Questions on taxes? There's one other thing I would note, and that is that the state legislature has been talking about making adjustments to the motor vehicle tax. We don't know what that will look like. We don't know when they'll do it, but there's been a lot of talk around it. It's likely then that the town might delay issuance of motor vehicle tax bills while that codifies a little bit. It's my understanding that at this point, they will not take up that discussion before July.
Why did they ever talk about that in the first place? Yes, it's not a question begging an answer.
That was a question from Martha, I believe.
And I don't think we have an answer for that.
No, I don't either.
If people are ready to move on, we can turn the page to page 3 of the budget document, licenses, permits, and fees. We had not originally proposed significant changes to the fee schedule. The one adjustment we had previously made, we actually revised even further, and that was to reduce the building permit fee revenue, which during the current year is $150,000 down to $140,000, and we're further reducing that to $120,000 for 21. We had spoken about previously how difficult this line is getting to project. The projects that are in front of the town at this point seem to be larger and taking longer. So the timing of the revenue is a little less consistent than it's been in prior years. And we were struggling previously to understand what that pattern would be. I will call your attention to a line 4056, the technology fund. We're carrying forward into 21 a revenue and expense out of the town's technology fund in order to support digitizing the records process for the clerk's office. I think that's something we've talked about previously, but certainly the experience of the last 3 months has made that even more critical, and the town's ready to move forward with that project.
Yeah, that I was very surprised. That's Martha. It's not a question. I was just very surprised that we hadn't done anything with that. So thank you.
Other comments or questions? If we can turn then to page 4 and 5, which is other town fees and income. This is where we start to see a more significant impact of those revenue reductions. We're looking about a 10% reduction of other town fees and income. And this is primarily driven by our seasonal areas, harbors and rec, for the most part, and I'll call out some specific lines, but for the most part, on the harbor side, we're looking at about a 75% revenue number. Again, whether that turns out to be 50, 60, or 85%, we'll have to wait and see. But what's in there for harbors generally is about 75%.
Chris, Willie, you have
I
a question?
will,
Sorry, Chris?
I just have one question, Amy. We never actually reviewed fee schedules before this budget. Have any fees changed?
there is one recommended fee change in harbors particularly, and that's public wharfage, which is Old Harbor Dockage. Of course, it goes up and goes down again, but the recommendation here is a 16% increase, which brings the per foot rate to $350. Of course, we've taken a haircut off of that down 75%, which brings you to the $113,100. We may, throughout this process, bring that number down even further, given the loss of additional footage, but it does include a rate increase.
That answers, that's why that's a 13%. It's not, it seems just to be the outlier in the harbor revenue that we have a 30%, negative 30, negative 25, negative 25, and negative 13. So that accounts for that extra 50 cents per foot
Adjustment.
adjustment. Okay, that explains that. And yes, this is the big revenue variable. I don't know what's going to happen this summer. It's going to be hopefully that holds. Thank you.
Sure.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Amy. Please go ahead.
That's okay. If we move down to some of the recreation lines, and again, if we need to, where we want to, we can talk about specific line items, but I've adjusted these along with the recreation director for what they think the program will be. Certain programs they know at this point will not be running. Certain other programs they're still deciding about. A good example would be Camp Mohegan. At $10,000 of revenue, that's half of what they normally see. And that's based on the current estimate, of course, subject to change, that they'd only be able to accommodate about half of the number of campers. A few lines down from that, recreation events with a recommended revised number of $19,050. That's going to reflect the fact that there's no triathlon this year. There may or may not be a half marathon in the fall, but hopes that we'll maintain the shad balloon for the following spring. And similar adjustments have been made to all of the other recreation lines. Questions on harbors or rec before I move further down the page?
Chris, Willie?
Amy, is that the Fred Benson beach rent? Is that the final number that's been determined for the summer? Is that the concessions rent number?
I can take that one, Amy. That's not final, but that's the conversation that primarily Sam has had with some of my involvement with the present vendor. I think I've spoken about this in previous meetings. The prospect of going out to bid for that really doesn't make a lot of sense this year. And given the considerable risk that that provider would be taking, we were looking at somewhere between 25% and 50%. This is about a little less than 25, but it also puts the risk for if something unexpected happens, this would be the rent amount, right? We could have gone a different route and said, we'll go a higher amount, but if something happens, and by that, I mean, there's enough concern out here that we need to make an adjustment to the beach and close the building, which means no concessions, then you'd have to write something in that would adjust for that. So instead, tried to put together an amount that allows them to open. It's also a truncated season. It might be truncated at the end. So that's not final, but that's what we're looking at for a rental amount from the concession provider.
And have you determined a start time? Or when will it be open, I guess is a question to,
So a little bit different answer than the one Chris just asked. Looking to open the building at the end of this week. I don't know when the concession would be prepared to open.
thank you.
Thank you, Amy. All right,
If I can draw your,
Sam Bird, do you have your hand up? Sam?
You got to unmute.
Yeah, hi. Just to clarify that a little bit, the latest discussions would be to open the concession stand the following week. We're talking right now, and all of this is tentative, but we're talking about opening the beach on the 13th, and the concession is gearing up towards opening on the 20th.
Thank you, Sam.
Amy, I apologize. It's just sometimes it's hard to see when the hands are raised and stuff. So it's going to be a little awkward, but please carry on.
if I can call your attention to line 4267, insurance and other recoveries at $75,443. That's two more unusual items. One is an insurance recovery related to injured on duty claims, and also includes the health insurance premium offset account that Jim had mentioned. This is a dollar amount that has been residing at the trust for some years. I can't remember off the top of my head how long, but resulted from prior premium savings that we are able to apply as an offset to this year. The school, I believe, used their account last year to offset their budget. And I think this is the right year for us to use these dollars. It is shared with the employees at the rate of the co-share. So this reflects only the town's portion.
Okay. Any questions on that? Okay, Amy.
I didn't have any other specific comments on other town fees and income. To Chris's original question, none of the other fees are looked at for adjustment this year, but I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any.
The Thomas property rent, does that reflect just the apartments in the front or the entire property?
That reflects the entire property with the idea that the two front apartments would actually be unoccupied next winter. So it's a partial year on the front apartments, but that the manager's house would be fully occupied.
Okay.
Actually, Amy, one question about that.
Go ahead, Chris. Long.
What, because I think before we were unable to meet on a regular or on regular business, we still had on the agenda for future discussion rent about regarding the manager's property or manager's house. And we never concluded that discussion. So what, as a placeholder, Amy, are you using just so because we're going to have to continue discussion in the near future. So what are you using as a placeholder specifically, just so we have, I don't know, just a talking point, I guess.
Sure, and again, this is just a projection. What's in there now is $2,300 per month for the manager's house.
Thank you.
And there is a housing assistance stipend showing up on the expense side. We'll talk about that when we get to it.
Thanks.
Yep.
Any other questions on this page? Okay. Carry on.
But before I turn the page, just a reminder that the transfer station usage fee is an estimate. It's in there at the current level of $20,000 annually, but that is out to bid in the contract, I believe, expires in November. So we would expect possibly a different response when that came back.
Okay.
Page 6 brings us to state aid. And this is where we're seeing the most significant impact in the revenue shortfalls. You can see a year-over-year decrease of 30%. And that's essentially in the hotel and meals tax. We're looking at about a $450,000 shortfall between the two of them. The numbers that are in here in front of you, $329,929 for the hotel and cottage, and $273,583 for the meals. Those are based on the governor's office new revisions, which were done by community. So it's not far off from the numbers we had put together here. It was nice to see everyone was mostly in the same range, but these were community-specific numbers put out by the governor's office. But of course, you know, 10%, 20% change in either direction makes a big difference to us. So it's yet another area of uncertainty.
So these are basically based on predictions of reduced occupation and meals. Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other?
It will be interesting to see, you know, I think we're all hearing some anecdotal commentary about how, particularly on the hotel and cottage tax, it's not purely a reduction, but maybe also a behavior change in the rental patterns. So I'm not sure that our numbers will track the state's projections quite as well, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Okay. But those projections, are they adjusted per community, or are they basically taking a cookie cutter approach and saying that, you know, they're expecting this kind of a shortfall across the state and just attaching it to a community? Or is it based on the fact that, well, you know, our reductions or our shortfalls may not be as bad as Warwick, or may not be as bad as another community for various different reasons, whether or not people have the impression of Block Island being a safe place to go, or whether or not people have an impression of another community being unsafe and they want to stay away, or another community has a bloom. I mean, is it based on anything like that, or is it specialized, or is it generalized?
In between, in that each community did have its own unique set of projections.
Yeah.
However, they were done at a pretty macro level. So I'm not sure an outside economist would project some of the nuances that we might be familiar with here on the ground, just in a more direct way.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, other questions?
I will say that, again, the legislature is unlikely to pick up the fiscal year 21 budget before July. And so any changes they might make relative to state aid, you know, would impact this budget. I cannot imagine that the relatively small amount we get in terms of fixed aid would be compromised, but we need to be aware of it.
Right. Okay. Let's move on.
Moving on to page 7 and reserves and transfers. We don't usually spend much time on this page. So let's start with the first line, which is the Block Island Land Trust note, $437,447. This is essentially a transfer from the Block Island Land Trust to reimburse the town for debt service that we pay on their behalf. So it's a direct in and out that matches entirely exactly and matches the timing of the bond payments as well. So you'll see an offsetting expense on the debt service page. What is relatively new for anyone who hasn't been with us very long is the reserve fund balance of $350,000. The last time this town used reserve funding to bring in revenue was in 2009. And it's not an easy decision. We're projecting a significant shortfall for the current year. It could range between 600 and 800,000, and that is going to reduce our current reserve level. So based on those projections, the most that I would be willing to recommend using to balance the fiscal year 21 budget is the 350,000. That should keep us just about in the 10 to 11% fund balance range. Our fund balance policy does not encourage the use of reserves. It does allow for one-time and unanticipated uses. I think that this fits into that category. It's not something that you will see on a recurring basis. We will not fund operations this way in the long term. But I do believe it gives us the flexibility that I talked about, that we need to see where this winds up. And if we need to make further corrections, we will. But I'm happy to talk more about that if people would like.
Does anyone have any questions or comments on that?
Yeah, I do.
Martha, go ahead.
Yeah, Amy, I'm pretty sure everybody at the table understands this, but could you run again through the implication with taking this amount out of reserve this year, that has to be made up from other places next year? That we're basically starting in a hole next year.
Sure. Yeah.
Just to make sure everybody's clear on it and it doesn't come from me. You're the voice of authority here.
This isn't, as Martha said, this isn't just something we can use and not put back. The infrastructure fund, we'll talk about that in a minute. That's a little bit different. But this is our emergency reserve fund, and we've worked hard to build it up to a fairly robust level. We will need to build it back up again. And so part of a multi-year plan is to not just not use reserves, but actually restore those levels. One way we could end up restoring those levels would be if we saw federal or state aid at the levels that replace lost revenue. Some of you who have been listening to the municipal leaders calls have heard that concept and that conversation about whether aid will be used for that purpose to replace some of the revenues we've lost. And if it does, that's great. That gets us back to a healthier reserve level. If not, we'll have to start putting aside as an expense item in future budgets, a rebuilding of the reserves, much like we've seen sewer do over the last 5 to 10 years, build their reserves back up.
Chris, I see
So
your
yes,
hand.
it's not.
Chris, I see your hand. Amy, real quick, what is our average, what do we usually put into reserves when we have the opportunity on an annual basis?
Again, we've been building reserves for the last 10 years,
Yep.
and our target range for this town is between 15 and 20%. At the end of last year, we were at 17%. This use will bring us down to about 10, 11%. So
Yeah.
we'll need to get from 10, 11% back up to 15% at a minimum.
Well, my
And
question,
we don't need to do that in 1 year. We can find a responsible plan that gets us there.
my question is, I'm sorry, my question was, I'm trying to remember how much we usually manage to put into reserves on an annual basis. I'm trying to get a comparison of what this represents in terms of what our annual contribution might be on the average.
Sure. If we're doing our jobs well, then we actually only put about between 50 and 150,000 into reserves.
Okay.
Because if we're putting a lot more than that into reserves, we're not managing. We're either over budgeting or underperforming.
Thank you.
So roughly 100,000 a year.
That puts it in perspective. Thank you. Chris Willie?
Yeah, I think Amy touched on it. What I guess is when we expend the reserves, we're mandated to put the reserves back up to a certain level. Is that level set by the state or by simply what we have previously kept our level at? I mean, I thought healthy, I think there was a comment made by maybe by Jim or maybe by you that most municipalities shoot for a 10, 11%. We're at 17%, which is better than probably 95% of the municipalities. So we're in good shape. So why do we have to get back up to 17, and how long do we have to do that?
It's driven by our own internal policy. So the town has adopted a fund balance policy that sets the guidelines for use for appropriate level and for replenishment. The reason that we maintain a higher level than some communities is because we are so isolated. We are so subject to extreme events. Hurricanes are the example we've always thought of in the past. And because we're unlikely to get outside aid quickly, I think I've given you the example that we received our Hurricane Sandy aid in this fiscal year. So we can't sit around and wait for somebody to come save us. We need to be prepared to handle things ourselves. And if and when that other outside aid comes through, that's great. But we need a little bit more of a savings cushion to see our way out of a particular situation.
So do you have a projection for getting us back up to, let's just call it 15%? If they took us 10 years to get to 17, what do you anticipate?
It didn't
Big
take us 10
question.
years to get to 17, but I honestly don't have an answer. I wish that I did. It would, you know, I'd feel like a superstar if I did, but there's just too much uncertainty right now for me to give you an honest answer.
So the point we should take away from this is we have to replenish it, and the rate's gonna depend on what we can actually do. Okay.
Well, it's more of a should replenish it, isn't it?
Yeah, yes.
It's a recommended action. It's not, I'm not sure if it's mandatory, but it's a recommended action based on our policies and based on the recommendations of our auditors and our fiscal manager.
Right. Our internal policies. Yeah, I'm clear.
Okay.
If I could, Ken,
Jim Kern?
people ask, what's the rule of thumb, or what's the objective? And nationally, the organizations that give you that kind of guidance, particularly in communities that are really struggling and they're just getting above the head above water, what do you try? And 10%, it's me who's mentioned that in the past. 10% is a good objective for a lot of communities. The thing that distinguishes, I was surprised when I got here, Amy, she was shooting for 16, 17. The thing that the biggest of the three things she listed is you're not going to get help. Your level of isolation. Hurricanes and other things hit a lot of people, but there's a level of isolation. The other thing you have to consider when you're talking about how quickly do you want to recover, as it says, that recovery comes from raising more money than you spent. Raising money generally, unless there's some unusual circumstance like state aid associated with an economic event, that money primarily comes from raising taxes or raising revenue through the normal sense. So you want to do that in a kind of a gradual. You want to manage your affairs intelligently so that you leave a surplus at the end of each year and you accumulate quickly. You don't want to go out of your way to overextend and recover quickly. And Ken's exactly right. The requirement is self-imposed, makes it that much more impressive that you were in the position that you were in to begin with.
Thank you, Jim. Chris, your hand is still up. You have something else?
Nope,
Okay.
sorry.
Thank you. Amy, go ahead.
Sure. While that requirement is self-imposed, there is a floor that will be externally imposed. We never want to get to the point where we have a rating agency concerned about our reserve levels. So we don't talk about it that often, but again, there is a floor that becomes a problem for other people.
Right. Okay. Any other questions on this? Let's move on.
Okay. So I'll have us move, stay on the same page, but move to the last line, which is a transfer in from the infrastructure fund of $353,000. For those who either aren't familiar or don't remember, in 2015, the town established an infrastructure fund using revenue from the easements to Deepwater and National Grid. And that fund was restricted to be used solely for renovations and improvements to the infrastructure of the town of New Shoreham. We have drawn on it in small scales In the past, the current balance of that fund is $508,000. And the suggestion at this point would be to use some of those funds, which don't need to be replenished, very different from our regular reserves. But at this point, in order to maintain some of our capital budget, and when we get to that page, we'll see a little bit more, but there's almost no room to fund a capital program given our current circumstances. That was a challenge in the budget we presented in March. It's obviously gotten more severe with this revision. But right now the proposal is to fund 3 projects with that $353,000. It's a replacement of the scale at the transfer station for $128,000. The deployment of bathrooms at Mansion Beach, $175,000. And then $70,000 to complete the project at West Beach and close the capping of the landfill. Again, we can talk more about the specifics of the project, but this is the revenue side that would fund those. They're not being funded through the tax base.
Okay.
Questions?
Andre, go ahead. You're muted.
No, I'm all good. Thank you, Amy. So the bathrooms at Mansion, what was the number on that?
175,000.
And is that Porta Johns?
No,
Or-
this is a formal permanent structure.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. I think those were a huge success, and I personally, I don't have a problem with that number. I'm good, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
Hold on, one more. That'll bring down the, so that fund, how much is actually in that fund?
$508,000.
Right now, that's the balance,
So that'll bring that fund down to 155.
and we're negotiating with Deep Grid right now for some more easements. Is that correct, Jim?
That's correct.
And that hasn't been, we don't have a number on that yet, ballpark or anything.
That would be the subject of a closed session meeting in a couple of days. So want to do that in closed session first. And for everybody, you want to keep that in mind, potential favorable event in the future, as I think Andre is pointing out, right? So it rolls into that fund, but
Okay.
not a case where it's available now. But yeah, one of the things people in Amy's seat and your seat like to think of when we do budgets, we like to think forward and, potential favorable, circumstance in that fund within the next year.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, Amy.
I think we're ready to move on to expenditures unless people have questions they want to go back to on revenue.
Go ahead.
Okay. So we'll move to page 8, which is administration. And before we get into the details of administration, I want to reiterate what Jim mentioned at the beginning of our session, that what's reflected, particularly under the wage and benefit lines, are some proposed numbers. They have not been agreed to by the bargaining unit. So you'll see yellow shading against the wage lines that indicates that there's a change in the revised budget. But I don't think we're prepared to have too much more conversation about the specifics of those at this point. In some departments, building department, town clerk's office, to some extent, police, there are personnel shifts that we know are coming, town manager. And we've done our best to create space for those programs to either be implemented or developed throughout the year. Again, there's a little bit of uncertainty in some of those as to how and when those program changes will take place. Again, we've tried to leave room for them. In some cases, there are specific programs being recommended, but it's part of the uncertainty we went into this budget with that's now been a little bit compounded by the situation that we're in. There are also some wholesale adjustments. We had our final health and dental numbers come in. In aggregate, they're about a decrease of 0.5%. We had level funded those rates and they've actually decreased a bit. So you're seeing those changes reflected in the benefit line. And the retirement contributions are essentially the same, going from last year to this year, a small change. But again, to put on your radar for the longer midterm, I would expect those to creep up in the next 2 years, probably, as we see some of those market adjustments get rolled into the new rates. So just a preview of another constraint we'll be facing down the road. With that, the specifics on administration. I'll start right in with a challenging one, which is the recommended revised level for the town manager wages. Again, it's a placeholder, it's a recommendation. The number that was originally put forward for fiscal year 21 was an extrapolation of the current rate. What's being shown there now, the 108,137, represents a step halfway through the entirety of the pay scale. So this is a step 7 on a 15-step scale, and probably more accurately reflects some of the requests that we're asking of all the employees. So again, I'm not necessarily putting a box around that number, but it's a recommendation given the context of what we're asking everybody else to participate in. And so the council can consider that as they go through their process.
Senator Riesland?
Sorry to be so late. Internet and the North End stinks. But anyway, Amy, have you looked at all? I know 2 names have been forwarded to us about potential town managers. You have, or Chris or Amy, do you have any understanding of that 108, 137 implication on those potential candidates?
Amy, go
Want me
ahead.
to answer
Before Chris answers, I'm not engaged in those conversations, so I'm not equipped to say. This is entirely without that context.
No, and I
No, like
appreciate
that.
that. I mean, and I like the analytics of it, but Chris, any?
Oh, we haven't engaged in those conversations either. We're going to start those on Wednesday. So I think Amy said it's a placeholder,
Okay.
and it's not boxed in. And I mean, you have to remember the other part of this is that I don't think, I'm going to assume is not reflected in here because it was reflected in the beginning of the budget, was the housing component. So
Right,
we are going to discuss that on
Wednesday.
our discussions on Wednesday.
Amy?
Sure, there is a housing stipend here. It's line 5525 for 8,400. And that's consistent with the preliminary conversations that the council had had. Again, it's a placeholder. The need to reflect revenue and expense appropriately necessitates that it show up on both sides. But it is here as a placeholder at 8,400.
So basically it's a 112 compensation, right?
116.
That would be 116. And that number for people at home is 5225. Amy said 5525. 5225.
Yeah, I don't think we're there yet.
Thank
There's
you.
some things we need to talk about.
Right. Thank you, Martha. Amy, go ahead.
Sure. Some of the other interesting items on the page, code updates, line 5407 with a recommended budget amount of $5,727. This is to catch up on the code recodification, which I think we're behind on, but would be planned for fiscal year 21. The line below there is one of the expense reductions, a sacrifice of the process. The $10,000 that had been in for a classification and comp study is recommended to come out at this point. And that's really 2 considerations. One, it's the need to trim expenditures, but also the recognition that with somebody new coming in, they may need realistically some time to get their feet under them before undertaking a study like this. Moving down to insurance, $269,822. We've gotten our firm quotes, our firm premiums for next year as opposed to just an indication. So that's the actual number. It is creeping a bit higher. So we're going to go through a little process to make sure that those insurance numbers are still appropriate and what we can do to manage that expense a little bit.
That's a pretty significant increase for this year, isn't it?
It's an increase on the budget. You can see the projected for 6/30/20, which is 257,806. So it had already crept up between our estimate for fiscal year 20 and the actual, and it's a further creep from there, which is all just compound into what's starting to be a really big number. So
All right.
it's going to take some time to do some work, but we will.
Okay, thank you. Other questions on this page or comments?
The Deer management, they may want to come back next week as part of the community support. I don't think we listed them separately. I do want to identify that the $15,000 that's recommended in the 21 budget is lower than their request. Their request was $24,075. And like I said, maybe we can make sure that they're available next Monday if they want to speak on behalf of that.
Okay.
So Ken May.
Andre, go ahead.
So Amy, just to clarify for the public, you got recommended and you have revised, and collective bargaining with the employees hasn't been completed yet. So these numbers could reflect more or less what is recommended after that, after those negotiations are through, or
No, I
Wanna
believe,
hold on.
go ahead.
So basically, I think what I'm asking is that the 1,473,34 would be maybe more of a realistic number than the one in the other column, or not? And I'm asking the question. I'm not trying to say that it is.
Go on.
No, I would say the 1473 or any number you're going to find in the recommended column across this budget is not something that the town can currently accommodate.
Okay.
The budget that we put forward in March doesn't reflect the expected reality. And so we need to make adjustments and revise. I would say that the revised column, which is in this page, 1,430,619, is subject to change based on those negotiations. Right now, it's the town's best projection.
Okay, thank you.
But it also reflects for the most part a freeze.
It does.
If I could, Ken, if you notice, this is the point I was making earlier, budget 2020, and then recommended 21, and then revised 21. As Amy says, whether the particular approach is the one that's arrived at, you're going to need to get to this kind of number in order to do the things that we want to do in terms of flexibility, in terms of retaining a reasonable reserve level. We're spending a good amount of reserves. We're shifting a good amount to the infrastructure. So if you look at those three columns, it's a reduction to an increase, which is to say it is not quite level funded. You can see 1426 to 1430. It's not quite level funded. There isn't a lot of room to work here. And I would point out that the projected for 2020 is 1454. But that's the objective, and but to Andre's question, it does the the revised does reflect the place that Amy and I think we need to get to.
Okay. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, Amy.
Other questions on administration before we move on?
Just one, Amy.
Ben, go ahead.
Thank you. Line 9,000. Sorry, but I like those words. Can you help me with that?
Contingency?
50,000?
Yes, so 50,000 has,
Sorry to call it out.
50,000 is,
It was on the page.
is the recommended level for 21. It's the current level that we're at. It's taken a lot to get here. It was significantly lower in previous years, but it still represents less than 1% of the total operating budget.
Yep.
So it's a contingency that allows the council to implement a program that maybe they didn't see coming, hire a surveyor. You know, it's small project contingency. This is not hurricane contingency, if that helps.
Yep. Yeah, but it's an area that helps you manage forward.
It does.
Thank you.
But that's a number you're also projecting and using this year, fiscal year 20.
Yes, that is part of conservative estimating for the current year. You're going to assume something's going to come up.
Okay.
And if I mean, I get that, but it's also 10 times 19, right? 9 times.
So what? It's a little misleading to say that, and I will and can look up a more accurate presentation, because when we do spend from contingency, we account for it in the project that it accomplishes.
Oh, okay.
So the council will make a transfer to fund out of contingency.
Thank you.
So that's not necessarily an accurate reflection. In many years, yes, it is underspent.
And I guess that's the reason I brought it up, because if you look at it, it looks like an increase, but I don't think the year of allocation is necessarily representative. So I think it's not as large an increase as it potentially could look.
Okay. Hold on.
Okay. If we can turn to page 9, finance.
Thank you.
Sure. You're seeing a couple ups and downs here. You're seeing an increase over the 20 budget that's primarily driven by a change in benefit situation. And you're seeing a decrease from the March presentation. Again, a combination of those wage adjustments and then some opportunities we've found to reduce other expenses. But none of those are really significant operationally. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Amy, for the first line.
Well, that's level. That's level. We have to thank everybody for that if they go for it. But thank you for Amy for putting it together.
That's right. Andre's got it right. That's the program here. If you look at, look at all 3 columns.
Any other questions or comments? All right.
Page 10, you have fire, rescue, and emergency management. Again, this essentially represents the dispatch functions of the town, and you're seeing those same proposed or representative wage freezes, but no operational changes. There has been from fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 21 a number of staffing changes, and so that's what's driving the 20 to 21 change.
Sven Rissen?
Amy, I'm sorry for all the internet issues, and I was very late. And if you said this, I apologize. In the wage freezing and in the delay or the flatlining, are we basically pushing all increases out another year? And so we're sort of taking a pause, if I use that word? and pushing everything out, or are there 2022 implications that one should be aware of?
Jim Kern?
That's something that's going to be a subject of collective bargaining. So it's not something, not that this is a big strategic tactical thing, but it's not something that we could answer tonight. There's a couple of different approaches. You've got one, but we really need to have that conversation with the collective bargaining groups before we answer. Otherwise, when you sit down with the collective bargaining group and you answered in a budget meeting.
Yep, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Jim.
Any other questions on this page? Okay, Amy.
Oh, I have one. I was trying to unmute myself. My question is on, actually on this year's budget, the hurricane preparedness.
Yes.
What was that?
So those are the ads that we typically run in the Block Island Times and in the summer issues to
Oh, yeah.
encourage residents and visitors. Many years we are able to secure EMA funding to offset those costs. Sometimes we can't, so we budget for it over here just in case, or we account for it over here.
Okay. Thanks.
Any other comments? All right, Amy.
On page 11, police. And again, you've got some changes from 20 to 21 in the recommended column, and then a move downward between the recommended and the revised. Most of the changes that you're seeing here are driven by the staffing levels as a result of bringing in a new officer, training, preparing them as a replacement for an engine on duty officer. Jim, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I would have said it the same way. The IOD process, well, the process that will likely be subsequent to the IOD has to play itself out, but in the meantime, there's an obligation relative to that position, but was actually most of it was done before my getting here. The community felt strongly to properly staff the department, and so there is going to be an overlap there for some period of time, and there are some other financial circumstances that may play themselves out to the town's benefit, but that's where we are now. As you know, we've got a new patrol officer that has started, and as Amy says, going through the process of being equipped and trained, et cetera. And so we're positioned well for the coming year.
Chris Willie?
Yeah, I need, and I know a lot of this happened before you came in, Jim, but I'm reading the March 11th narrative. My question comes looking at, we're hiring a fifth police officer for 2021, or that's what's budgeted for. The new officer that was just hired, I know that hiring process was back in the fall. I thought that was to replace the officer that was out on IOD status when that was realized they would not be returning. And I thought that was the dialogue we had back then, the reasoning for it. So why are we budgeting for another police officer in 2021? And when did we see that proposal or any of the reasoning behind it? I don't remember ever having a discussion at the town council level with the chief or even with Ed Roberge before he left about that. So can we get clarification on that before we move forward with that? I mean, I'd like to see something other than the number.
Amy?
I can't speak to most of Chris's question, but just to clarify that the additional officer was an unbudgeted expense in the current year. So you're seeing it introduced for the first time in 21. So the jump from 20 to 21 is that implementation of that program. It's not as though it's being budgeted for a second time. You're seeing it for the first time on a budget perspective. The rest of it, I can't.
We have 4 officers and a chief of police right now, 4 full-time officers and a chief of police, correct?
Amy?
I'm asking anybody. Jim's
No.
the, Amy's the finance director.
All right,
I mean, we have 4 full-time police officers and a chief of police. What are we budgeting for next year? 4 and a chief or 5 and a chief?
Well, you have 5 and a chief plus somebody who's still on IOD. I'm sorry, 4 and a chief plus somebody who's still on IOD.
All right, so in 2020,
So
or before this person went on,
as Amy said, Chris, the place where this was, shall we say, an unbudgeted expense was in the present year. So we're not adding this circumstance in the next year. We added it in the present year, and it's showing up in the budget for next year. Adding one this year and adding one next year, where we added one this year and it's being represented accurately next year, is the way I would say it. We can put it all on a piece of paper so people can see what happened when.
I think it's important because, I mean, I clearly don't remember. I remember when we were notified that we would be hiring a new police officer. I thought it was specific to replace the individual out on IOD. And we appointed that person a few weeks ago, if I remember right.
Well, further back than that. Seems like a few weeks, but it's been.
Yeah, I mean, you know, a little while back, we appointed that person. She's my neighbor.
January.
So that person I thought was to replace the individual out on IOD. Am I wrong?
No.
Okay.
I think partly, not speaking for the people that were here, but the expectation was that the IOD would reconcile itself more quickly.
And that's, because would it be helpful? It'd be helpful for me if we could break out that expense. I don't know, it doesn't have to be on this budget, but something on paper would be extremely helpful because there's some confusion out, not just with me, but with the public at large.
Sure.
Ben Reeson?
I think Amy said something before, which was helpful to me, and it caught me. If I look at, we've been focused on the budget FY 2020, the recommended and the revised. If you go to the projected, that is pretty much relatively flat. And I think to your point, Amy, a second ago, you said it's in the projected, it wasn't in the budget, and now it's carrying forward. So I think maybe if Jim, you can write something up on this, it would help because I'm sure there are many people who are looking at going flat, and it will help, to Chris's point, everybody understand that it's in the projected current and it's moving forward. So that write-up would help, Jim.
Okay, Andre?
2 things. So correct me if I'm wrong. This budget is reflecting basically hiring another police officer for this year. The increase of 77,000 from the budget and the revised. There's been discussion of adding another other than the new young lady that we just swore in, just so I'm clear.
No. And I think No, and I think it's best to for me to
Okay,
put
Jim.
something together so then everybody can follow.
Yeah, okay, Jim, thank you so much. Yeah, obviously, there's a few of us that are confused here about this. And Ken, you're working with the union right now for are you working with Officer DiMatteo right now and how's that going? When will that be complete?
We've only had one meeting so far, just an interim meeting, an introductory meeting.
Okay. So you will have something to bring to the council on that soon?
Yeah.
Any idea when?
Jim, we'll be, go ahead.
I can answer. Given our somewhat compressed timeline with respect to getting the financial, kind of getting this whole picture, we're probably doing this a little bit more quickly than we normally would. And I'd like to we've had preliminary conversations with the police department bargaining group, a very preliminary conversation with the NSEA, and I had a conversation with Superintendent Convery today. So trying to kind of at least get a substantive conversation with each collective bargaining group, and I expect to do that within the next week, so Monday. So this week, and then be able to have the conversation with the council.
So we have an interim town meeting. We could probably start to have a conversation, Andre.
Okay, thank you.
Any further discussion on this?
I don't have any more questions on that. No, thank you.
Amy? Go ahead.
Okay. No other questions. We'll move to page 12 with highways and maintenance. As you can see from the yellow, there's not a lot of change between the recommended and the revised. There are some adjustments between the current budget and the 21 budget. So I'll call those to your attention. We'll start, I think, with maintenance facility stabilization, with a recommended level of $50,000. For 21, that's a reduction from the current year, given that it reflects some of the spending that's been happening out of this line, and the workload has been primarily driven by some of the capital projects that have been implemented. It feels more appropriate for the level of work that can get done. Three lines below there, you have maintenance hydrants with an increase of 29,900. This is, I apologize, not in the narrative, somehow I missed it, but as the water company is adjusting its rates to more accurately capture the costs of providing those fire suppression services, they are increasing their fire suppression charges to their customers. And that includes the town as the owner of the hydrants. So this reflects those new rates that they are putting through in their budget process. And an item that is not funded, but we need to talk about, is line 7426 for maintenance landfill slope. As part of the capital, we are proposing completing that West Beach capping project. That means that after this year, or after that capping is complete, we will need to maintain that slope on an ongoing annual basis. That estimate has been about $20,000. I keep that blank line there so that we don't forget about it. But that'll be necessary in an upcoming budget. I think those are the highlights. I'm happy to take questions if people have them.
Sven Reesom?
Amy, I know we got a large grant, plus there's some donations as far as Andy's Way, trying to get at least one project from the Shoreline Access Working Group done. Do I assume that the grants will cover all that?
I believe that it will. We didn't talk about it specifically, but under the engineering line of administration, we should be able to accommodate any additional town costs for that project.
Thank you.
Amy, the amount of money we have designated for the refurbishing of the Thomas House, the actual Thomas House, is that, where is that reflected? And is that a project, because we have that money designated, we can continue on with that?
It's not reflected in the general fund operating budget. It's in a separate capital project fund.
Okay.
And because it was authorized separately, yes, it's not subject to appropriation. We had already committed that 1.5 million for the 2 units.
Yeah.
At some point, it probably does make sense to have a separate agenda item and update on that.
Yeah.
But
Good.
it's not reflected here.
Okay, thank you. I think it's important that we continue it though, since we do have the funding, that it hasn't gone away. So, Andre?
Thank you, Ken. Amy, I'm not sure if this is on this page, but and I guess it's a question for Jim. The maintenance of all, like, you know, when the town restroom opens and the public restrooms in Old Harbor, do you foresee an increase to the cost of the town for the extra cleaning that's going to need to be done on these?
We've, I'll get to the end of the answer and then I'll back it in. Not sure.
Okay.
It follows that we should, but we're not sure until we get the results. Sam has updated the invitation to bid informed by some of the new guidance. And so it would follow that if we're asking you to do more, you would bid higher, but I think there are some mitigating circumstances too. I think you could argue it may not be as busy this year. And so we'll see how that goes.
Okay, thank you.
Sven Riesel?
I would say, Amy and Jim, following Andre's logic, the whole Tippy Can world, there's a lot more disposable takeout items. I know a number of the restaurants have said, boy, there's going to be a lot more trash. So we may just want to keep an eye on that in the same vein.
I think that's a valid concern. I think clearly there's going to be a shift in that use. It seems to me that there will be anyway.
That shouldn't be impacting the Tippy Cans.
People are taking takeout.
I understand, but if you're getting takeout,
Yeah.
you either eat outside a restaurant or you're going home.
Or you're eating it on the park benches all around town, or you're eating it somewhere else because you can't eat it in the restaurant. So
I think it's reasonable to expect an increase.
It falls hand in hand with Andre's comment. I mean, they're going to flow together, or not.
That has driven me nuts to since the chicken place used to have red and white containers on the street all the time.
any further
We
comments?
shouldn't be paying for their takeout.
I actually agree, Martha.
I do too.
Any further comments on this page? Let's continue.
If we turn the page to harbors, page 13 of the budget.
Got it.
You've had a significant set of personnel changes that drive this budget down. And then we've taken a reduction of a few of the seasonal line items based on the idea that you may see decreased traffic. Sewer and refuse are two of those examples. They're not significant numbers, so that we feel like if it doesn't materialize, we can still accommodate. One of the perhaps more interesting lines is actually planned for this year, and that's the dredging in Old Harbor. 21 was anticipated to be a dredge year in a every 2-year cycle. The recommendation from the harbor master, and I think anyone who goes to Old Harbor can see, is that the every 2-year program is not working. And so going forward, it really needs to be an annual program. And so, like I said, it was going to be a 21 expense anyway, but we need to keep in mind the need to start funding that and implementing that process annually so that we don't lose the dock footage that we have in this year.
I have a Martha, I've got a question
Go ahead, Martha.
about that dredging. Yeah, I was up in the church the other day, and I noticed that the bait dock is completely not a dock. And what are we going to do about that? That's going to be more than just dredging.
Dredge it.
Chris?
So is Kate, I think Kate McConville's on, the harbor master. Is this something that we have an annual permit for, so we can do this every year? It's nothing, I mean, do we have to get a permit every year, I guess? Or can we just do it as an annual maintenance, under a maintenance permit?
Hi, this is Kate McConville.
Okay.
It was a 5-year permit, and it expired this year. I requested through DEM and CRMC for an emergency permit this spring. They did not deem it necessary. They didn't think it was a safety concern. I disagree. I'm trying to push to get this section of the dock into the fall dredge, which will occur in October. So this is ongoing.
And this is, when you say dredge, this is the mechanical, meaning they use a net. This is when they use the excavator, not the Currituck. This is inside the basin, just around the bait dock, right?
The one in the fall is going to be in the inner basin, but does not include this section on their map. And it also will include the anchorage area.
The town's maintenance dredging is the one that's done with mechanically with the excavator.
Okay.
So the other one that Kate's talking about is the one that's coming in to do the inner basin also.
So that's the
And
federal
it's gonna be
project.
much more significant. It's this project around the bait dock is going to be more significant than just a backhoe.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought that we were on Army Corps maintenance for the channel.
We are, but that's just for the channel itself. That's not around the bait dock. We've lost at least 75 to 100 feet, and the revenue this year of loss is going to be extremely significant. Never mind the loss in revenue because of lack of rafting. So this is very.
So okay, you're talking about the inner basin?
I'm talking about the inner basin. I'm talking about all around the old bait dock as well.
Yeah, that's what I was referencing, that phenomenal amount of sand in there. And it seems like there's got to be something else besides just dredging that we can do. It's probably a discussion for another day.
It's been an ongoing discussion over a number of years, and it's been a recurring situation.
It's gotten worse.
Which is why I asked that it be kept in the budget for every year, an annual dredge at least. I'm working on trying to get that rectified, hopefully this fall.
And I think in the
Good,
past,
thank you, Kate.
in the past, I think there's been some discussion of using the spoils from the maintenance dredging that the town does for maintenance at the transfer station at the repairs that were done down there. So we might want to be able to tie that in and make it seem more appealing to the CRMC.
That was,
Well,
already, that was already in the request.
Thank you, Kate. I should have known. Amy, go ahead. All right, does anyone have any questions? Or going once, going twice. Does anyone have their hand raised? I don't see it. Okay. I guess we'll
Nope.
move. Martha, go ahead.
No, I just said I didn't have a question.
Okay. All right.
Then we can move on to page 14, which is the building officials department. There's a significant number of changes going on here, so I'm actually going to turn it over to Jim to talk about some of the staffing program that will be coming down the pike.
Jim Kern?
So I think this is another place where a printed spreadsheet or narrative will be beneficial. I wasn't able to get to it before this meeting, but I think it will be helpful because, as Amy says, there are a lot of moving pieces, and I want people to be able to just read it and see what's what. But in general, as all of the participants know, and some people listening, I would expect most people listening know, our longtime building official has indicated his interest in retiring, and it's gone on for some number of months. And this proposed budget accomplishes that, or it lays out how we think best to approach that, and that is to, I think, as people also know, there were a number of things that Mark Tilson was doing that is not, well, it's not only not likely, I think it's almost impossible, all of the different qualifications and my term, maybe not his, the grandfathering of the inspections he was able to do. So looking at the recommended and the revised has that residential inspector come up. First line is just the basic building official responsibility, and that's a partial year. I believe we set it up to be starting into the fall. I need to go back and look at my notes. So that's breaking out the building official. The next line, residential inspector, includes mechanical, plumbing, and electrical. Those were each on the order of about 10,000, maybe a little less. But I'll have that in the spreadsheet. And then there's also an element in there for kind of a continued, might call it a consulting or a 1099 engagement, or in this case, it would still be an employee engagement, either before those came on or concurrent with those coming on, using Mark in that role. We've also broken off the zoning enforcement. So Mark was doing all of those things. We're looking to break off zoning enforcement. That's somewhat representative of the size of the others. With the idea that maybe able to get somebody to come from another community. Obviously, these aren't full-time, they're part-time. You really can't do them as a 1099. They are, by most definitions, under the IRS codes, an employee. So that's what you're looking at, a partial year on a building official and partial years on mechanical, plumbing, and electrical. There may be some overlap. You get somebody qualified to do more than one of those, then we see using that funding to pay that person. The other element of this, if you look back to budget fiscal year 2020 relative to the housing inspector, the minimum housing, fire safety, and wastewater, you have a $20,000 item, a $20,000 budget for minimum housing, $20,000 for fire safety, and $4,000 for the septic inspector. So the prospective, this was the previous town manager's prospective plan. And as you can see, the justification for that being a full-time position was based in minimum housing and fire. The present occupant or the projected person that was going to fill that role has indicated he's not interested in being a fire safety inspector. So we've changed the approach such that a minimum housing inspector amount is funded, and then a separate fire safety inspector amount is funded for $15,000, and then potentially a wastewater inspector. Whether who fills those roles is gonna be determined as we go into the year, and the full-time versus part-time element of that also remains to be seen. The rest of, looking at the rest of this, I think it stays pretty much the same. Clerk, the clerk, and then benefits would adjust. Again, we're looking at decreases to an increase, revised versus recommended. But I'll put together a spreadsheet or a table probably that identifies the elements of what I will describe as breaking up the present building officials job into the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, potentially 6 different other pieces.
Chris Willie?
Thanks, Jim. We kind of knew this was coming. Can any of these, let's just take wastewater inspector, can't we, can't these be subbed out? I mean, or just be a separate inspection that homeowners have to get? Does it have to be a town position? Can it just be basically a, I mean, I know there's a number of people that are certified as wastewater inspectors, and how many homes that need to be inspected on an annual basis. Why can't this be a,
I mean, don't by a certified consultant?
yeah, outside consultant, exactly.
I couldn't, but I expect it was what Chris repeated. I think, again, go to the end of the answer and work back to the beginning. I think potentially in the future, I think the answer to that question is yes. In my conversations with people here, and I've lived through it in other communities, there was a good amount of effort put into getting to the point that you are now, where the significant reductions in I'm going to call it septic issues have been a big focus in that in that position and that effort. And when the basic approach that Chris described was presented to me, I think you can see how the business part of it may work, that that local qualified inspectors, some of whom are installers, would sign off on that work and certify that the work was done to the town. That's particularly, it seems to make sense process-wise with respect to an installation. I'm not completely conversant on the number of re-inspections or annual inspections on Block Island or the state of Rhode Island as much as I am in Massachusetts. But I think we want to be careful to make sure we don't take a big step back with respect to the actual performance of that regime. But I think potentially, maybe not this year, but in a future year, I think what Chris and Ken described may be not only plausible, but workable.
Thank you, Jim. Sven Rissom, do you have your hand up? No. Okay.
Jim answered it.
Okay. Anything further on this one? I'll remind everybody that we need to, we do need to move along because we do have folks waiting to be involved in the third item in the agenda, which is the department level review. So Amy, go ahead, please. Amy, you're muted, I think.
Sorry about that.
There you go.
If we want to turn to page 15 and recreation. Originally, there were no real operational changes proposed for the recreation department. There are adjustments now as a result of some of the constraints on holding those programs. And so what you're seeing here matches basically the adjustments on the revenue side, where certain sports camps, certain events we know or anticipate will not be held. Others, we're still waiting for decisions. Other programs like ongoing maintenance of Heinz Field, operation of the beach facility, we know need to continue to happen, sometimes at even maybe a higher cost. And so I think as a global approach to recreation, they're going to run as much as they can and as creatively as they can, but we've had to eliminate some programs already.
Any questions or comments from the council? Sven Reesum?
So just to make sure I heard you, Amy, in essence, you're taking a conservative approach and there could be upside, meaning increased revenue, but at least we're covering all the costs.
That's the goal, yes. To
Thank
always
you.
make sure we have room for the cost.
Thank you.
Discussion? Anything else? Next.
On page 16, you have library. And I believe most of the library discussion will be held for next Monday. But you can see there aren't too many significant changes to the programming. There was a vacant part-time position that was actually planned to be filled halfway through the current year. The library director was able and agreed to hold off on that, and it's been deferred again for fiscal year 21. So that's the difference between the recommended amount for wages other and the revised, is holding off on that part-time position.
Okay, any questions or comments? Thank you, Amy.
And may I say something about that?
Andre, go ahead.
Just that, you know, I'd like to commend the library director, how she's run that library during this time. You know, she's got her YouTube videos going, and, you know, I know everybody's pulling their weight in this town, but, you know, that's kind of outside of our purview there a little bit. And, you know, personally, I'm very happy with the way things are going down there.
Thank you, Andre.
Great.
Okay,
And
Amy.
like I said, we'll talk more about the library, I think, next Monday.
Yeah.
On page 17, you have GIS technology. And this is a case where we're not showing a requested column. The requests for funding were certainly higher than what's being put forward here. Not that those programs and that technology doesn't need to be implemented. It's just a constraint of the dollars. And so there is still an increase, particularly in the equipment replacement and in the license and maintenance costs. Know that those are less than what was requested. The equipment replacement is really two components, aged equipment replacement, as well as upgrades that are necessary as part of the police technology implementation that is coming over the next 2 years. And then on the license and maintenance contracts, most of the additional expense is licensing for the workstation upgrades that are necessary to keep the network secure.
So the consulting for the broadband is basically done at this point. We're ready to move into the next step, or what?
I'm going to treat it like a good thing that there's no funding there, because the goal is that the big project is happening and moving forward. And so a little bit of pot of money here isn't going to get us the big thing, which is what we're focused on.
Right,
How's that?
okay. Thank you. Chris Willie?
Amy, the projection at 133,890 for line 5400. What's the variable there? Why?
Sure. Most of that, most of the divergence between the budget and the projection has come in the last 3 months as a result of the town's significant shifts to technology-based platforms. This is an area where we're still working through all of the billing details in order to carve out the potentially eligible expenses that could be covered by reimbursement.
So some
But
of this
that's
might be,
essentially.
so some of this might be reimbursable.
Some of it might be. There's been some sticky language for reimbursements around technology, which everyone sort of says has to be relieved because everyone has moved to a technology-based environment. And so there are obvious costs associated with that. But there's been a little bit of pushback in the FEMA and funding world. So the communities continue to argue that these costs be considered eligible.
Thank you.
Further comments? Okay, thank you.
On page 18, boards and commissions. Again, you're essentially looking at staffing changes combined with those NSEA negotiations, but no major operational changes here.
Questions or comments? Chris Van Riesen?
Amy, just real quickly, I know the council appointed a sea level rise committee, or has been appointed, excuse me, permitted, and then we're gonna have discussions about members, et cetera, over the next few months. Is there a small budget that can be thought of for that? Any committee starting up, just sort of getting started of 5,000 or some small amount just for consulting, or would that come out of that contingency we discussed earlier?
No,
Well, you said small and then you said 5,000, and that's two different answers.
well, you didn't ask for money when we created it. Go ahead, Amy, sorry.
So yeah, generally as boards get started, there are some expected startup costs. They're usually smaller than 5. But if they need to be a little bit more, then the committee can always come to the council and ask for some support.
Thank you.
Willie?
Under line 5112, consultant planner, what do we have upcoming that's going to require? Like, I know the comp plan was a big one. What else is out there that we need? The consultant at 42,000. Do we have anything? I'm not sure.
I'm going to have to defer to Jim or somebody else on that, but I can tell you that 42,240 is part of a contract. But as far as the work plan, I have to defer to somebody else.
Is the contract? Hold on, Jim. Sorry. Is the add to the question for Jim? Is that contract specific to what? I mean, our planners sitting in on Zoom meetings. I understand that might be under GIS technology. Jim, can you answer those questions for me?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to get back to you on that in terms of what the separation of work is, and what the town has traditionally paid that consultant / planner to do. I don't think this budget contemplated anything significantly different. I think looking at the actual for 19 and 20, there's an increase, but I'm not going to speculate. There may be some technology, the shift to the online platform that we've done, that may be part of it. But I'll find out what the additional, slightly additional amount to this year and kind of tradition, the historical use of that position.
Well, I guess, Amy, you mentioned it's contracted, so we have to put that number in there because that's what the contract is for. But we don't necessarily have to use that number if there's not planning work to be done, right?
It is based, and I'm speaking from memory here, so forgive me, but it is based on the work and the split between the two GIS and planner programs. It is based on the work that is performed, and that's where I would point out 2 things. The actual for 2019, I believe, had some extenuating circumstances. If you look at the 3-year average at 41,836, that's probably a more representative number. And again, there's a split between GIS and planning that I think is dependent on the workload at the time.
Thank you.
Any other
Because
questions,
haven't we had, as Martha,
Martha?
I mean, in the planning GIS world, wouldn't some of the work that hasn't been done that normally would be done for planning have been shifted over with all of these meetings that we've been trying to facilitate in a way which we're not accustomed?
Not sure I completely
And I
understand.
should have asked this back. I should have asked this back with GIS. I think we're going to. It looks like there are going to be more meetings on Zoom before this is over. Because things like zoning and planning and HDC have not been meeting for months, and they're going to have to start up again.
That's true. I'm not sure if I understood the question to be the breakdown between planning and GIS, or just that there was more.
Oh, it was just kind of a comment, Jim. It wasn't really a question.
Okay.
Other questions or comments? Okay, let's move on to general fund operating and capital budget or community support.
And community support, we're going to generally hold for discussion next Monday, as well as the school. You can see there's not much variation, though, between what was recommended in March and what is being presented in front of you today. If anyone needs additional copies of those community support requests, I'm happy to provide them, particularly with fire and rescue. What they requested and what's recommended has a significant variance, and I'm sure they'll want to discuss that. But yeah, most of those conversations will hold till next week.
Okay, we'll jump over those two, both that and the school then, and go right to capital tax, page 21.
Okay.
Can I just ask a question about that to Amy? Do we have their budget requests broken down somewhere?
We have their original hard copy submissions, and I will, Andre, make sure that you get a set. If anyone else needs a set, I'm happy to send.
Andre, who are you referring to?
And I apologize. This may have come in March before the plague hit, and the specific requests from the community support groups. I remember last year, and I had back and forth with Jim about this. The paperwork Ed had come up with, the former town manager, about submitting the request in writing, and then we got last year budget season, we got those requests like in our packets, and I apologize if I did get them in March.
We
but
did.
we did get them.
We'll get you more.
No. If we got them, I can dig them up. I just, all right. I have a week. Thank you.
Capital tax.
Sure, capital tax. So this is a page with that's really separate from historical context. So the fiscal year 20 budget, 377,000 was a pretty significant reduction from the budgets that had been put forth previously. We were working up towards about a $600,000 capital level. In 20, it was reduced by about 100,000, and then additional capital items were moved to the operating budget. Sometimes that was really appropriate, but again, it gets hard to know what the right capital level of expenditure is from a historical perspective looking at this page. The recommended amount for 21 at 588 was an effort to get back to that historical target of about 600,000. It did rely on the infrastructure fund for some of that, but not entirely. As we had to deal with the revenue reductions, we've had to reduce the capital budget again by eliminating projects or deferring them, and also expanding the use of the infrastructure fund. So the projects that are left for consideration now are the transfer station scale upgrades, $128,000 to be funded through the capital and operating budget. $40,000 to continue the library window upgrade project, which is partially offset by a grant program. This is phase 2. Phase 1 is going on now. So it's important to maintain the momentum on that project. Technology, the $55,000 is sort of the lowest floor that we can go to in order to implement the technology upgrades that need to happen at the police department. And that's going to be part of a mandated implementation. This is the minimum we need to get started and maintain the time frame that we need to be operating under. 175 for Mansion Beach bathrooms. Again, there was a lot of, it felt like a lot of support for this project in its trial stages. We've kept it in here. It felt like a project that served all of the users on Block Island. We've proposed funding from the infrastructure fund for that, but a way to keep some of that momentum in implementing a couple new development ideas. As a contrast, we have deferred funding for additional construction at the hospitality center. This was designed to be the town's contribution towards that project, with the idea that, again, there may be some regrouping, reevaluation as that program refines itself a little bit and people get a sense of the volume of traffic over this summer. But we were able to maintain the funding for the West Beach landfill, the $70,000 that's anticipated to be needed to complete that project and finalize the capping with DEM. If the council remembers, we actually have a bid open on that project, which means that we have a great price in hand, ready to go. So again, it's sort of a shovel-ready execution, something that we can wrap up and finally move forward from. So in total, that's a capital budget of $468,000, 353 of which is funded from the infrastructure fund. It's not necessarily a capital program I feel great about. It's not enough, and it's not supported enough by the total budget, but it's what we could maintain given these times.
The current situation. Amy, the one question on the technology upgrade on the line 5632, you mentioned the police station. The difference being $20,000. Not being familiar with the details of it, what does the shortfall mean in terms of the upgrade, and is it not such that it would be more appropriate to take a little bit more out of the reserve fund and just fully fund it at this time to finish whatever the upgrade was recommended as?
Off the top of my head, I believe the total cost of that project is $150,000. So we were already splitting it into a 2-year program. In order to stick to the time frame that we'll be under, this was sort of the minimum that you needed to get started and still adhere to the time frame. Funding more gets you closer to the end faster.
So it wasn't.
But again, it was part of that.
It wasn't necessarily an arbitrary. It's not necessarily an arbitrary number. It's a number that is a number as a whole within itself, and then can be built upon next year as appropriate.
Will have to be built upon, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't want to think that we had taken a recommended action and reduced it by $20,000 for a reason that wasn't strong enough to justify doing it. But if it's a
right, it's not the difference between 80% and 100%. You're funding, I don't know what the numbers are, but you're not there. You're not that close to 100%. So.
Okay, so it's a stable action. Okay, all right. Other questions or comments on this? Sven Reeson?
Yeah, the only I think, as I think everybody knows, the Ronuskis were talking a lot about the visitor center. I definitely want to dig into this and figure out how we can sort of push those dollars out. I understand it. I get it. We are, but hopefully we can work that one through to maybe future years or something like that. So that'll be a key opportunity for the town council to discuss with the family.
Okay. Other comments? Amy, go ahead.
Sure. And I don't think the council received a multi-year capital program this year, given the change in personnel. I don't think we had a traditional capital planning process. I will work on getting you that so you can at least see what things were not funded this year. To talk through them quickly, again, I'll give you a piece, make sure you have a piece of paper to refer back to. But we also had requests to support renovations of the Davidson House. The library windows are in. There's a window replacement program requested for the North Light. I'm sure Fire and Rescue will talk more about their capital program when they are with us. We have the imminent need to replace the Marine Patrol boat, which again, hopefully, or maybe we can match with a grant program. And we also had requests for solar trash and recycling receptacles to be implemented this year. That was not funded. And I think that was all that came through as direct requests, but again, I'll get you some supporting documentation on the rest of the capital program so you can see what's in the out years.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Let's move on to the final page, page 22, debt service.
Debt service. So again, debt service, there is still opportunity that the town will pursue to refund, and we may be able to realize a little bit of savings in the current year. We do have the BIPCO debt service. That bond is maturing in November. I've included a full amount of that debt service here. And then I think it's important to always remember that there are projects for which we have not issued bonds. That's the Thomas Property Housing Initiative and the CII broadband network, as well as the seed money for the island-wide broadband network. Those bonds have not been issued. When they are, the total debt service across those programs adds about $150,000 to our debt service expense. Those won't be hitting in fiscal year 21, but again, I don't want people to forget that they're out there. That is a bill that will come due for the town. We have a significant amount of debt service that ends in fiscal year 22. So we're at the end of life for a number of bonds as we think about bringing those and other new projects on board.
Okay, Andre? You're muted.
Amy, thank you for that. Could you just go into a little bit of detail on the bond that matures in November for BIPCO? What does that mean?
What does that mean? In order to acquire the 2/3 of BIPCO stock that the town did, we borrowed $1.8 million.
Yes.
Those were done as short-term borrowings with the idea that the town would not be holding ownership in BIPCO or its different forms for the long term. And so that note has been renewed once. It was issued as a 2-year note. We've renewed it once and it matures again in November. And so the town will have to take action as to how we proceed with that.
Okay, so that's a discussion for later. All right, thank you. Appreciate it.
Any questions or comments? Okay, I recommend we move on to our next item on the agenda. Thank you, Amy, for the review. I recommend we move on to the next item on the agenda. That's department level review. several departments. At this point, we will, if there's any, as we have this discussion, we'll see how if we can try and incorporate any discussion from anyone else who might have some comments on this. So bear with us as we move along. The first one we've listed is administration. Again, we should probably highlight what page we'll be working off of.
That'd be page 8.
Thank you. Amy, you want to start the discussion, or how do we want to proceed? Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I apologize for maybe jamming up your process by going into, I think, pretty good detail for a first pass earlier. You know, if people want to ask questions again, I think that's probably the best way to go rather than me starting from the beginning. But if there's something we missed the first time or that maybe wasn't as clear, now's a great chance to come back to it. And if anyone of the other participants wanted to raise a hand, this is probably a good time as well.
Yeah, this is Martha. I've got a question, which was basically what Amy just said. I'm not, what are we doing here that we haven't already done? We're taking questions, or? I just don't understand what we're doing.
Basically, we're
I don't
doing
understand.
a department level review. We're doing a department level review where we usually have the departments or anyone might have comments or questions from other than the council able to ask questions or make comments. There's a budget here.
Okay, so basically it's going back and asking people if they have, outside of the council, if they have comments and questions.
Right, as Amy pointed out, yeah, our first blush of the budget sort of lasts a little bit longer than we thought it might, but yes.
It was comprehensive. I appreciate it.
Okay. So any questions or comments from anyone on this, on the administration budget? There again, if someone has any questions who's just listening in on the phone, the way to get our attention is by pressing *9 on your telephone. That's raising your quote unquote virtual hand, and we'll try to recognize you by name and then unmute your phone. If anyone has any questions, bring it on. Amy, go ahead.
Sure, and most of them don't need invitation, but this might be a great chance for any of the department heads, if I miss something that they feel like needed to be added. If I didn't necessarily get everything.
I basically is sitting here, in addition to those managing the meeting in another room, sitting here, I have a picture in front, I have a screen in front of me with several faces on it, several telephones on it, and then I have a list of folks on the side of the screen with their phone numbers and some indication of who they are and some indications that are not indicated who they are. So I can see when someone raises their hand, there's a little blue hand that raises up, and I try to call on people during the meeting. So I am scanning now all of those to see if there's anyone who would like to chime in. And not seeing anyone at this point in time. If it's taking someone some time to chime in, I'll don't be afraid. I'll come back to you if you have a question while we move on to a different item. So let's move on to finance. I'm sure the finance director is listening.
I have nothing left to say.
Okay. Any questions or comments on that at this point for anyone else? Fire and rescue and emergency management. There again, let's pull up the proper page number. Sorry. Somehow my
Page 11.
page 11. Thank you. Somehow my sheets are totally out of order now. As I am you. So this is
Oh.
no, actually that's police. Page 11 is police. Fire rescue, emergency management.
Page 10.
Thank
That's,
you. So do we have anyone listening or anyone on the dais that wants to have any comments or questions on this? This includes the wages for the emergency management directors, the dispatchers' wages, education and trainings, electricity, fuel oil. This is all, I assume, for the fire barn. Building maintenance, ground maintenance, equipment maintenance, and that sort of thing. Anyone have anything? Yep, I see someone's hand up. Millie, do you have the indicator? There you go. Yes, who's that?
I think I just got unmuted. I am Kristen Bauman, a resident of High Street. Can you hear me?
Hi, Kristen, go ahead, yes.
Hi, wow, hi guys. Thanks for inviting me to the process. I don't know where, it took me a little bit. I was watching, well, you know, you don't need to know all the logistics, but I'm now on my phone and able to participate. And so my question may not be at the point you're at, but I wanted to say that it may not be the time to do bathrooms at Mansion Beach. We may just have to live without those for another year or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10. That is a chunk of money that we may not need to spend. And another question separate from that is I echo the concern and sentiment around what's going on with the police department, and I hope we can get clear on that. The size of that staff and what we're doing, and you know, that budget has gotten very large over the last few years. So I hope we can get clear on that. Should I hang up? Does that make sense? Okay. Thank you.
Yep. Sven Reeson.
The only thing on, just going back, and thank you, Kristen, but on fire and rescue, page 10, the one thing I will say, Amy, is again, they have done an amazing job on training this past year. And I realize it's sort of a budget this year projected at like 1,800 and we're going to 350. So I get all that, but I think that fire and rescue has done just a phenomenal job of getting young folks involved, getting trained, whether it's, you know, down the bluffs or National Guard or whatever. So I think as we go forward, that is one area where I don't want to lose the momentum, and we all know what can happen, you know, if suddenly we go flat. So just keeping in mind, training is
I don't
more than it appears to be, I guess.
I don't think this is their budget, Sven. I believe that's on a different budget. Amy, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, so the training line that you're seeing in front of you, Sven, is going to be primarily for training of the dispatchers, which is also very important. The training you're talking about is going to be covered under the community support appropriation for Block Island Fire and Rescue.
My apologies.
And I think they'll make that argument for you next Monday.
I'm sure they will. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Any further comments on the fire rescue emergency management budget? Any comments on the police budget?
One just got one.
Any comments on the highways? Highways would be on page 12 of 22. Questions or comments? While we're waiting for someone to raise their hand, I'll point out that we are starting, reigniting the work over there on West Beach, on West Side Road, starting at Smugglers all the way over to Champlin's to get the sidewalk project done. We have indications that they'll be trying to do that in an expedited fashion. And we ask for everyone to pay attention when going over in that direction. And you may have to not go via the boat basin unless you're actually going to the boat basin. If you have to go over to the west side, it'd be better off to go over Center Road because it will be working on the curbing and on the sidewalk over there. And as soon as they get it done, the better, obviously, for all of us. Anyone have any questions other than that for highways or comments? Highways budget? Not seeing any, we'll move on to harbors. We did have a good discussion, I think, on some of the items on the harbors budget already. But if anyone has any other questions or concerns they want to bring up, I'll open it up. I don't see any. Kate, are you there? Did you have a comment? I don't think so. Nope, okay. All right, buildings. Any comments or questions about recreation? About the recreation budget, we've already reviewed a little bit. I think Dave Sniffen was on earlier. Dave, if you're there, if you have any questions, now would be the time to pop in.
I don't really have any questions or anything, just it's pretty self-explanatory. We're just trying to do the best we can with what's going on.
Right. And thank you, Dave. You seem to be on the ball with everything. You're trying to make sure everyone's safe and everything, both at the beach and also over at the playground. So we appreciate your efforts along those lines, and hopefully things will get better as the summer goes on. And I did have a question on someone emailed me a question. There was a question that came up about whether or not the playground was closed, and yes, it is closed. That's why it's all fenced off for now. As soon as we get indications from the state and or the CDC and the Rhode Island Department of Health that it's safe to reopen those, we will. But until that time, we will be keeping it closed, as far as I'm concerned. So, any other comments or questions on the recreation budget? We had a discussion on the GIS and technology budget. Was there any follow-up question on that? While someone may be trying to chime in, I'll just open it up to the last 3 or 4, and if anyone has any questions on any of them, they can just do it out of order. The boards and commissions, or capital improvement program, or the debt service. Those are the last 3 or 4. If anyone has any comments they'd like to bring to our attention, or things they want to bring up at this point, either from the council or from the public that are listening in. Not seeing any, I'll give any final call for anyone on the council that wants to bring anything up with this particular agenda on these items, and especially on the department level review. Any questions or comments? I think Amy's heard a lot of comments, and Jim's gotten some direction in terms of getting some things written down or get things printed out for informational purposes. And I'm sure they'll follow up on those. If there's nothing further, I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Can I just say one thing before we adjourn?
Yes, you can. I don't have a second.
Second, I'll second, and then then we can have discussion.
All right.
I want to make a note. I want to make a note that on Friday, which was also, the anniversary of D-Day, June 6th, was also Council Martha Ball's birthday. And I want to take the time to wish Martha Ball on behalf of the council and anybody who's listening, a very happy birthday and a very healthy new year to you, Martha Ball.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And don't worry, we didn't try to figure out when the actual birth date, what year the birth date was.
She'll tell us.
Why?
Congratulations, Martha. Many
Happy
Thanks, Ken.
many happy returns.
Thank you, gentlemen.
All those in favor of adjourning, say aye.
Aye.
Chris?
Aye.
Bye.
Martha? Myself, aye. Amy, thank you for your time and effort. And Jim, same to you. Thank you for your efforts. And we'll look forward to the next budget hearing next Monday. And have a great week. Thank you, everyone.
We are also having a meeting Wednesday, correct?
We're having a meeting Wednesday.
Yes.
Not a budget hearing.
Okay.
Where's my cupcake?
We ate it.
It's right next to the big freaking things of balloons that I got for you that are illegal.
Thank you. Good night,
Thank you.
everybody.
Good night.
Night.